All right, Bart, welcome to the podcast. You're finally on the couch with Hooley. It's not a van trip, Bart. It's actually just us in a massive studio this time. I haven't seen you since last year. So what have you been up to since I last saw you?
Well, yes, it is a bit like our chats in the van, isn't it? And not quite as cozy. Since last year, I have been busy.
Yep.
Mainly in the workshop. I also had a little bit of shoulder surgery done.
Yeah.
It was planned, don't panic. Old mountain bike injury, so I deliberately chose the off season to get that done.
Yep.
And it's been a slow recovery, but coming on strong now, so ready for the new season.
Yeah. Has much been going on in the workshop since I've last been there?
Yeah, it has actually. We got some really interesting cars at Moore Engineering. So we got obviously New South Wales Fastest Spectrum, which you know very well. We got Steve Webb's Elfin with a Repco V8 engine in it. Really special car.
Yep.
So Steve dropped that off just to get a few jobs done before he kicks off at Phillip Island, the big historic meeting there early in the year. And then we've got a couple of pre-war cars, which is a bit rare for us. And obviously my Radical, and we've got a Porsche GT4 there. So pretty widespread of cars, really. Yeah,
right. Did you go to the Porsche Carrera Cup day at Eastern Creek, or did you not go out?
Well, actually, I was there yesterday. So, yeah good timing. I was there doing a track night session in the evening.
Yep.
But knowing they were out there, I did go for a bit of a perv and caught up with Wally and had a good look at the car. And
Dave didn't put you in the car at all, did he?
No. He's smarter than that. Threw away the keys. But yeah, they are impressive. And it's funny when you walk up and down the pits there. And we say it every time that new generation of Porsche Cup cars come out. How do Porsche do it? They're so much better. And it's not one area, but the tyres have evolved. Michelin come up with a new tyre and they just refine them. And I think it's hard to know how much faster they're going to be, but all the drivers are pretty wrapped.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think about the cars though? Do you reckon they'll create better racing, or do you reckon it'll be more spread out because of the aero on them?
I don't know. Carrera Cup's hasn't been known for its racing as such over the years, but having said that, last year it was pretty good. I don't think it'll change massively. I just hope that it doesn't create a bigger gap between the pro and the AM drivers, but we'll see. Yeah.
So now we obviously know each other really well. Normally with other drivers and other guests here, I kind of start a bit awkwardly, but I know you so well because we're actually a race team together. But I want to know about the real Barton Mawer and the kid that grew up on the farm racing a go-kart.
Yeah, so I guess to just rewind a little bit, so you touched on my father, Dave Mawer. Very strong constructor and engineering business. So that's where my interest started. Moore Engineering in Orangeville, up on the hill, big shed and the family house. And basically, as a kid, I was just around engineering and cars. So I got a splattered big toe on my right foot from dropping a big spanner off the hacksaw onto my foot.
Jesus.
Obviously not wearing shoes at the time, so that was the first lesson. Wear good shoes in a workshop. And then through my mum, Diane and David, just always just around race cars. I remember running home from school off the bus to get into the shed and see what Dad and the guys were working on and sitting in cars and just all of that. So it's been my life the whole time. I got a paddock basher, so I was keen to get a go-kart and I found an ad in the local trading post. That's when they used newspapers and not
internet these days.
And for $50 there was a go-kart.
Yeah.
I mean, to call it a go-kart is a bit insulting to every other go-kart in the world. It was water pipe for a chassis, a Victor lawnmower engine.
Did you build it yourself, or was it?
No, it was actually already built, which I think that's why Dad was happy, because at that time, he was so busy. So the deal was I save up half, he'd pay the other half, $25. So I did all the chores, bought this go-kart, and honestly, I just thrashed this thing around. I made tracks with old race tires through the paddock. Got stopwatches out, got my mates to time me, and that was really the start. I just fell in love with just working on this thing in the stinking hot summer days, trying to work out how to get it going. And I'd run up the driveway at pace, do a U-turn and come back, but naturally building up more and more speed. And it was just at a crest too. I remember I went flying up, front end got light, I turned and nothing happened. And I just went straight into the veranda post.
Jesus.
And I went forward and collected my nuts on the steering wheel, and I was in a lot of pain. So I basically hobbled back down to the workshop, which is only a couple hundred metres away.
Yep.
And Dad was running the Formula Holden team at that time, and he had some of his mechanics there. And I hobbled in hoping to get some sympathy and cried out to one of the mechanics and said it was Murray. And Murray, I just crashed. And he said, what happened, Bart? I said, it understeered into the veranda post. And he stopped me. He said, Bart, it didn't understeer into the veranda post. You understeered it into the veranda post. So it's just things like that. Just
that was your first lesson of about
first lesson. Don't shift
something.
the blame when you stuff up. So, and I still got that thing hanging up in the little shed.
Yep.
And I just hope I never have to get it going, because I remember how much work it was to keep it going. And I just hope, either of our two boys that don't have to go through all that.
Yeah, I was going to bring up that the two boys, you got Felix and Jasper. You obviously are a driver coach. You coach myself and a lot of other people. You're hoping to get them into go-karts, right?
Well, I don't know if hoping's the word. I'd like to support them in whatever they want to do. And Jasper's certainly shown a lot of interest.
Yep.
But honestly, on the other hand, and I don't mean to sound too down about this, but I just know how much I've invested emotionally and physically to do what I wanted to do, and realistically fallen short of what I aimed to do. So I don't know if I'd want to put that on them directly, but if they want to do something, I would support
so
them.
no pressure there at all.
No.
So you were talking about your dad obviously running a Formula Holden team and open wheel. He loves Formula cars, because I've been there with him while you've been racing at the track yourself. It's just astonishing looking at the Formula 3 cars. What are the most, how many cars has he actually had in the shed at one time back in the day before, the cars that are in there now? Yeah,
look, the shed's big, but as a number, maybe 6 cars or something, but probably more the journey, obviously well before my time, of David, and he's such a generous person with his time. He's a natural teacher. So the people that he's had through Moore Engineering when it was based in Sydney, in Ashfield, people like Wal Story and Elwyn Bickley, and ultimately Bruce Carey, and then after that, people like, and not so well known as those guys, but Roger Tide, who went to Renault F1 and worked there, and Matthew Hannaford, and these guys were winners of New South Wales Apprentices of the Year, and then even before my time was guys like Larry Perkins rebuilding cars in his workshop, and then Mark Larkham later on, and so not so much the volume, but just the spread of how many people he's helped.
Yep.
And impacted over the years.
Yep. What about a bit of time when you, and obviously you got on your website, you and a picture of you and your dad racing go-karts. What was your time in go-karts as a kid? Do you remember who you raced? Did you have any rivalries? Did you have any fun things in the pits that you can remember?
Oh, yeah. I do cherish the karting times.
Yep.
It was intense with my dad. We were pretty, and I guess a lot of father-sons are, and it was enjoyable, but it was quite testing, when you're living and then working and then racing together.
You're just in each other's face the whole time.
Yeah. But rivalries, I only ever really karted locally. I never went actually out of New South Wales, but really some great battles with Jason Varley, Neil McFadden, and racing against Michael Caruso and
Winterbottom.
Winterbottom was sort of really a bit in front of me, and I definitely couldn't get close to him in anything I raced. So yeah, lots of good karting drivers.
I remember when I got into karts, your mum was actually secretary of Sydney Go-Kart Club.
Yep.
And she still is to this day helping out, obviously, Eastern Creek, Sydney Motorsport Park, and the Go-Kart Club. She doesn't do as much as she did back then, but she still helps out. Do you remember the time where you weren't even racing, you were obviously overseas or racing in a big track, and she'd still help up the go-kart track? Would she tell you any things back then, what was happening in that land? Or
yeah, she's a little power packet, isn't she, Diane? But she'd just get on with it. She'd just do it.
Yeah.
Unless the building was burning down, she wouldn't make a fuss. But she just always was around the racetrack. And then you're right. When I went overseas, I think it was a bit of a hole for her. So she really took to being the secretary of Sydney Kart Racing Club. And then later on, she worked for the New South Wales Road Racing Club and secretary there. And she just loves the people. She loves being around the racetrack, and she's been around it since she was a teenager.
Yeah.
So a lot of people presume that my influence and energy comes from my father.
Yeah.
And a lot of it does, but Diane just as much so. I mean, even when I was young and she was working in the business, they were running the Formula Holden team, looking after 3 kids. She was off to TAFE, studying electronics to try to work out how to build a data logger system for the Formula Holden.
Really?
So, oh, yeah, she's full on.
So for her influence in car racing, where did that come from? Did that just come from marrying your dad, or was your great grandfather or your grandfather?
No, my father David and Diane, that was the first of their family to get involved in motorsport.
Yep.
Not many viewers would know of the Party House, but it was a bit of a group in Sydney, and they were involved with that. That's how they met. And then they had friends, and basically all their friends were in motorsport. So. And they all went off to do different things, whether it was racing or constructing or going overseas. And that was a strong bond. That their closest friends to this day stem from the Party House.
Yeah, right. Well, obviously, we've spoken about your parents. I want to know a bit more about your siblings. Like, obviously, I know about you, and I only really found out more about your sister and your other family when you happened to get a bit of COVID over Christmas. So can you explain, like, obviously, you got yourself and your family, but who's your sister, and why is she living overseas?
Probably to get as far away from racing as I can. So I've got 2 sisters. I've got an elder sister, Kimberly, who's living in London, and she's been there for nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
And a younger sister, Ashley. And to be honest, and it's not till you're older you appreciate it, but it was just so all-consuming when we were young with me racing through karting and then Formula Ford. And they really, suffered to the point of not having the time for mum and dad, and we'd be away traveling all the time, and they'd come away sometimes, but they didn't. Neither of them are into motorsport, and I think Kimberly, my older sister, she saw me get run over once at Lithgow in the go-karts. Ever since then, she's been pretty nervous. But when I was in the UK and racing, she did come to the races, and a really good base for me. So I would go to London on the weekends and stay with her. And that was a big help when you're overseas to have, and I'm pretty close with both of them, but Kimberly. And so that was really good. And I think she valued that as much as I did.
Yeah, right. Well, obviously you were saying about racing in the UK. I just want to go back to when you started your car career. Where you won 11, was it 11 straight, or you just won 11 races in the historic ranks in Formula Ford before you moved on to the national series? What was your time in historic Formula Ford racing your dad's car?
Yeah, that was interesting because we were karting and trying to work out how we could get into car racing.
Yep.
We had the written off first Mawer chassis that Brooklyn rode off at Winton, and all the remains and left over. And they were just dead bones at that point. But then they brought in the first wave of historic Formula Ford. So then it became eligible and suddenly had a value. So Dad said, right, let's rebuild it. So we had all the bits there, all the radiators and all the things. And I just used to spend time after school working on the car and getting it ready. And to the point where it's a bit more common practice now, but I applied to the school, my high school, Broughton, and asked for, instead of school sport, and I was quite sporty anyway, but instead of going out and doing other sports, to focus my time and energy on
building a car.
So whether at that time I was racing karts, whether we go and test or run in engines, or mostly in the workshop preparing for the weekends. So then I spent the last year karting, building up the Formula Ford, and then entered the historic scene.
Yep.
And which is pretty unusual pathway for an up-and-coming driver. I mean, most of the historics are older drivers enjoying the...
Although I kind of replicated that. I kind of did the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But at the time, I certainly wasn't that common. And a lot of people sort of were a bit bemused by what we were doing, but it was the only way I could get into a car. And then, of course, we cleaned up in the historics, and that car has an incredible history. It won 2 national titles in the past with Paul Bernasconi and Russell Norton. So it was always an amazing car. I mean, Dad just hit the sweet spot with that car. And then that culminated in the last race of the year at Sandown. Alex Davison came out and had a run in the Elfin. I think it was the 600 of John Benson's, and we cleaned up down there, won that race. And then we were able to sell that car and then buy a more modern 92 Van Diemen, enter the Stage Series, and then that was the start of.
Yep, and that was much like your Formula 3 career. You actually had a lot of secondhand equipment, but you're actually doing 10 times better than most of the other drivers. Not to talk yourself up, but you're actually doing quite well in secondhand equipment and actually getting top 5 and podiums and even a few race wins. You did actually win at Albert Park, didn't you? Oh, no, sorry, Adelaide. Was it Adelaide or Albert Park?
Yeah, I did. And I guess that was just using our resources. So while we didn't have a flush budget, we obviously with Dad's expertise and having our own workshop, we could prepare the cars and run the cars. So fortunately, at that level, as in the junior categories, the older machinery isn't a massive hindrance. Yeah. And I don't think at that point it was holding me back. And it was all part of the learning. And while it was incredibly frustrating that Dad made me do so much work, that the lion's share of the work to get the cars ready. Yeah. And it did impact my ability to focus on the driving, but then it's given me a much deeper understanding and other tools to use later in my career. Yeah,
yeah. And so, you obviously had done that part of your Formula Ford career. You only did, from memory, I think was it half a national campaign, and then you tested a sports sedan, and then you attempted to go the tin top route for a bit?
Yeah, it was always dangling around us because a lot of the customers we had around from Mawer Engineering were touring cars, particularly Michael Quinn, Phoenix, running Super Touring team, and I had a test in that and a couple other cars. But I still have my heart set on going overseas and seeing how far I could go with open wheeler. So I tested the cars and that was great, but nothing was going to take my eyes off that.
So you tested the sports sedan, even though it was fast, you were like, no, I'm going to stay clear on the open wheeler route and just head into the Formula 3. And then this is where everyone started to get to know you. So at this point, Formula Ford is like a hard charging type of thing. A lot of people are trying to get their names out there, but you found your nook and cranny, your pathway for you. You drove an F3 Dallara in Australia. This is where you got a name for yourself. Everyone remembers the white and green helmet, similar to Ayrton Senna, leading the pack. You were racing, I think, Will Power and a few of the other blokes back then. Do you remember much about your time back then?
Oh, yeah, of course. So I entered the last round of the Formula 3 Championship in 2002.
Yep.
And that was at the Gold Coast. So, and we qualified on the second row, debut, behind Will Power and I think James Manderson.
Yep.
And, I mean, it was a high spot and a low spot for me. Yeah. F3 car at Indy.
Yeah.
And I charged into the first corner. I tapped somebody with a nose cone into the first corner, and the way that 96 Dallara was had a very long one-piece nose body cone, and it really strangely folded the bonnet up into a big crease in front of me.
Yeah, right.
And I couldn't see where I was going. So I'm at Indy.
Yeah. And around a street circuit.
Around the street track.
Yep.
So then I'm driving around, and look, in hindsight, I could just pull it over, but I didn't want to stop. So I'm driving down wrestling this bodywork, trying to rip it off or pull it to one side, trying to keep up with the pack on the first lap. And unbeknown to me, a driver gone around the outside of me, and I couldn't see them, and I clipped, and I went straight in the wall. So,
Jesus.
So that was Formula 3. So then we spent the off-season rebuilding it, and then that was the full campaign in 2003.
How'd that campaign go?
That was a good year. Like you said, that was when I really – Formula 3 cars seemed to suit me a bit more, that downforce and the high grip and the commitment. And we just had a season-long tussle, mainly with Michael Caruso, but there were some really good drivers running Formula 3 then.
Was Neil McFadden in that class as well? Was McFadden in that class?
No, right. He did race later, but that was the year he won the National Formula 4 Championship.
Yeah.
And, we just had a seesaw battle with Caruso, swapping the lead. In and out of the steward's room all year, and he pipped us at the end, and we got runner-up.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So now you've obviously raced in Australia, you've done your thing, here's your chance, and you've actually been selected a part of before the Cam Rising Star. It was kind of like a thing with you, Tony Ricciardello, who else have I got? There's
the scholarship,
the scholarship, Will Power, the scholarship. Yeah. I remember you actually. Not many people know this, but how I got into cars was actually not via my stepdad. My stepdad took me out to the track to see if I liked racing or not. but you were actually the first person to take me around a racetrack in a Ferrari. And that was, I think, a part of the scholarship. You're actually trying to, you know, show yourself, a bit of show and tell, and try and get a bit of sponsorship for overseas, correct?
Yeah, that's right. You got a good memory, Dan. So yeah, it was really good. It was Marsh Insurance who were working in conjunction with CAMS and trying to work on every year. They had a scholarship for up and coming drivers. We went to AIS, and I went a couple of years actually, but it was really good. They worked on psychology, obviously fitness, media, and all of that sort of thing. And so I won that scholarship, and then that budget was allocated for the next season. So yeah.
Were you actually camera shy before you got into car racing, or like camera, media shy, or not really?
No,
because I you know, stay at the factory every now and then and work on my own car, which is good about more engineering. You actually have, like you, Dad taught you hands on.
That's right.
Your parents cook a lovely meal, by the way. Is it all about learning and that racecraft that helped you in the factory, helped you get to where you were and at that part of your career, like to a rising star? Did that make you realize, like, hey, I've actually made a bit of a career out of it at this point?
Oh, look, I think at that point it's not a career. I'm still trying to forge my way through. But, yeah, definitely. And Mum and Dad were very clear that, look, you know, we can help you work on a car, but you need to put up the other skills. So they encouraged me in things like at school to go in the debating team, and I always took up any opportunity for public speaking. And in fact, one of my sponsors in Formula Ford,
who was the sponsor? Do you remember?
Oh, it was one of the personal investors.
Oh, okay. Yep.
He paid for me to go and get some public speaking courses.
Yeah, right.
So there was some really good people around, realizing, you know, maybe I was terrible at it, but realizing that, that's an important side of it, and I really took it on early on.
Yeah. Did you always have the number 27 mainly, or was it just shifting between numbers throughout your?
It was shifting. It was a bit of a default number that I'd go to if it was available, but I'm not fussy on numbers. I'm just
Because the reason I bring this up is I remember you telling me you were going down to pick up a race engine in Victoria, and you're like, "Oh, do you know Mark Larkham actually got a supercar built at my dad's shop?" And I was like, "Holy shit, that's actually pretty cool," because not many people actually know that Dave actually gave a crack at supercars.
Yeah, and look, it's the first car that Mark Larkham built and ran in supercars, and it had a big reputation, and really fell short. So that was where, led by Mark, it was a lot of open wheeler philosophy brought into the V8 supercar. There was too much too soon, and I think everyone appreciates that now. I remember as a kid in the workshop, and the guys had just been working night and day. I mean, they were delirious by this point, and we were watching the TV of the start of the first V8 supercar round, which Mark was not at.
Yeah.
And I was looking at the shell, and there was still things being made, and we watched the start. And it was a pretty depressing sight of falling so far short. And then from that back foot, they never really got to a point to show the car's worth. A lot of things from that car are now in supercars. Things like Mark developed the carbon safety cell.
Yep.
And he's sat very central in the car, which a lot of people laughed at, and things like that have evolved, but it was a lot to take on so soon. Yeah,
he had a very engineering brain. So back to you after Mark. You're now over in the UK. This is where everyone starts to look, because you're racing overseas. You're chasing an F1 career, which is hard in itself. Even though now you need to have a billionaire dad, back then you still need a lot of budget to race there. You actually did, I think, the British UK Championship first, and then you gave the national class later. But can you explain a bit more about the British Formula 3 campaign and who you were with? So
off the back of doing Australian Formula 3 and going really well, and developing a good relationship with Bruce Carey, so that was Dad's very good friend who unfortunately since passed.
Yeah,
he engineered me, and he really was the catalyst to get me to England, because only a couple of years before he'd set up Carlin F3 team for Trevor. So he got me over there. I did a test at the end of 2003 with a B class team, performance, and then they were really keen to have me on board in 2004. So basically I just jumped at it, nowhere near a budget in place, but they were very understanding of my situation, and to the point where, and this sort of leading back to what you're talking about, utilizing my skills. I went to the factory.
Mm-hmm.
They had a little motorhome.
Yep.
I slept in the motorhome. I lived in the factory, and I worked on the car myself. So we sort of had half a use of a mechanic, and I ran the car myself. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but I was just sleeping in the factory. There was no shower or anything in the factory. Yep. So there was a little truck stop down the road. So I'd borrowed a bike. I'd ride down to the truck stop in the morning, get breakfast. There was a communal
like shower. Yeah.
So I just wait out the front till it was empty.
Yep.
Run in.
Yep.
Have a quick shower. I didn't linger. And then got out of there and worked on the car myself, which even at that time was.
Yeah. Were you overwhelmed living at, how old were you then?
Not young by
like
standards now,
mid-20s
but
or
early 20s.
Okay. Were you overwhelmed living over there, what you said there, or you were just like not fazed by it because the way your parents had brought you up?
Yeah, I think going to England from Australia is pretty easy, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it's not
bar the big trip,
yeah,
it's
not that much of a culture change. I wouldn't care if I was living in the desert. I just want to go racing. And, and I mean, it sounds cruel, but I loved it over in England because I eventually started working as a driver trainer. I worked for people like Palmer Sport and that. And then I'd be every day, you were either at the track testing, working at the track, training, going to the workshop, and I didn't have any other distractions. I didn't have weddings to go to or, you know,
just full focus.
Birthdays and, you know, Arnie's birthdays and all that rubbish. I would just, it was only about racing, and that's all you did. And even to the point where later on when I was living in Buckingham, you'd go out for dinner to the pub and there was all guys from their fun teams and other drivers there. You would just live and breathe motorsport. That's all you did.
Were you starstruck by seeing any of those guys around like that area or not really? You were just like, you're just focused on winning and getting to the next stage of your career.
just focus on the next race. I mean, it just, never starstruck, but certainly looking back, it was mixing with some pretty cool people. Yeah.
Obviously, I've spoken about with you that I want to race a Formula 3 car. Can you actually explain the difference? Because you did the national class and there was a class above. Can you actually explain the classes to me and the listeners?
Yeah, so basically, like most categories do now, Formula 3 have a build cycle of 3 or 4 years where they'll freeze the design, race that, and then update it. So then they'll have, and it's changed name over the years, but the B class, national class, with the older spec cars, which is predominantly what I raced. And then you had the outright cars. But even with the older cars, you know, I'd quite often crack the top 10. I think the highest I finished was 6 at Croft, and then quite often beating the outright car.
Yeah.
Even with an older detuned engine B-spec car. But the budget was just so much cheaper for the B-spec. I tried to go up to the outright class after 2004 was half a season. In 2005, we were able to do the full season with T-Sport.
Yep.
And we got second to that. And then I tried to step up for the outright class next year. Didn't have the budget. So that's when 2006, I went to America.
Yeah, that's what I was going to touch on.
Went over to from Atlantic.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, that we've been speaking about this in the van. I'm a huge fan of IndyCar. You've even seen me watch it at your place. Explain your time in America and what it's like. Obviously, racing in Australia, like the different scenes. You've got Australia, you know, Europe and America. What's the difference between the 3 countries in racing? Did you have a purse?
Yeah, I mean, Australia's got competition.
Yep.
But England's just got the depth.
Yep.
So Australia, you might have in the junior categories, you know, top 5 is strong. In Europe, it's just the top 20.
Yep.
Then America's a whole different culture, and that was probably, if I had a low point in the career, and I don't have regrets, but probably didn't play that so well. I was just so desperate to get over there and get started. But America's culture is strange. I remember going to the driver's briefing, and they're trying to say basically you can't defend or block into a corner except the first lap or the last lap.
Yep.
This is where I just come from Europe, where drivers were just
crazy, doing whatever they want. Yeah.
At the end of a straight, and nothing get done about it. It was just survival of the fittest. And the culture, I just mistook.
You were the backmarker team, weren't you? And it was at Formula Atlantis. That's pretty much F2 in America, isn't it, or F3?
Yeah, I mean it was a feeder category to Champ Car. To the point where, and the reason why I went over was it was a whole big resurgence to Formula Atlantic to get the best drivers over into IndyCar. So the winner of the championship basically got a fund to drive straight into IndyCars.
Yep.
And so that brought over drivers like Simon Pagenaud, Graham Rahal, Hinchcliffe, and drivers from all around the globe with a brand new Swift Formula Atlantic car.
Yep.
So I went over there with some funding with the Australian Motorsport Foundation and everything else that I sort of managed to, accumulate the support over the years. And I was trying to get into Team Australia, so they'd already committed to Simon Pagenaud, not so Australian, but turns out a pretty good driver. And they were trying to get an Australian in the other seat. So I missed that seat, and I should have just waited.
Yeah.
But,
do you regret any of that at that stage of not waiting, or did you just think, hey, this is my life?
I regret not waiting because that was with Walker, Team Walker, who were running Will Power in the Indy cars, and they were trying to help me a lot. And he basically said pretty much wait, but I didn't listen. So I went with a back market team, and we struggled. I did 3 races.
Yeah. What was the team called?
Sorry?
What was the team called?
Transwest.
Okay.
And by the 3rd race, I got 10th, but then it all fizzled. The problem with that was then I'd run out of budget. I was in America. I didn't have a green card, so I couldn't work.
Yeah, you were struggling over there, weren't you?
And then I was in a hole. So
didn't you have a girlfriend over there?
Yeah, I met an American girl.
Yep.
The team was based in Georgia, Atlanta.
Yep.
And so that's down south.
Yep.
And we're a little bit out, and she was living in a proper hood.
Yeah.
And so it was a pretty rough area, and I was sort of stuck. I didn't have enough money to get out. I couldn't work, I couldn't race, and
Did you call back home?
Oh yeah, I called back home. I probably didn't, explain the full situation, and so that's when I did a bit of driver coaching.
Yep, in America,
another Formula Atlantic driver.
Yep.
And then that's sort of when the A1GP thing sort of started.
Yeah. Okay.
Boiling.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
Not boiling, but
Yeah. So I was going to bring up the A1GP. A1GP was massive. You were a part. I think you were a part of the first Australian team, weren't you?
I think it was
or the second,
year 2.
First or second.
Yeah.
How'd you find Alan docking and the whole Alan Jones scenario? Because it was very promoted over here at the time.
It was a great concept, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I found the team pretty easy to work with.
Yep.
As in, I knew Alan docking a lot. I got really close to racing with them in Formula 3, and being an Aussie, and after Will Power, he was really keen to sort of keep the Australian Motorsport Foundation channel going there, and then I chose to go with T-Sport. But so the connection was already there, knew the people, and so I went and tested at Silverstone.
Yep.
And that was how I was able to get out of America. Went to Silverstone, and that at that point it was just a pre-season test.
Yep.
And we all just basically had one crack at it. So the Australian drivers we had at that test was Ian Dyke, Carl Reindler, and myself.
Mm-hmm.
And they had these Avon tyres and tyre warmers. First time I used tyre warmers.
Yep.
And I'd gone to that test just so pumped up. And the engineer said, look, Bart, you got to go out. You got to have the grip.
Mm-hmm.
You just got to go for it, and then it's going to drop off. So I took on board what he said, maybe a bit too well. I went on the outlap, and then on the outlap through the complex at Silverstone, the last sector, I set a purple sector on my outlap for the whole day. And this Hockenberg were there, and like all the teams. I was just on it.
Yeah.
And by the end of that first lap, the tyres were already degrading.
Really?
Yeah. So
was that because it was a harder compound, or is it?
No, quite soft. And with the tyre warmers, like all you had to do was warm up the brakes. Like,
yeah, right.
It was just on.
So they were quick for pretty much the first 4 laps, and then they'll just die off.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Did you do many races, or was it just the test?
No. So I did the test. Went really well. I think it was about 6 fastest of all the countries. And then, but I didn't get the race drive, but they kept me on as the test reserve driver. So I did the full tour with the team, and it sort of started to become pretty obvious about halfway through I wasn't going to race that season. So as a reserve driver, it was my duty to go to all the A1GP social gatherings.
Yep.
And enjoy that.
It was like a mini F1 back then, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was pretty wild. There was lots of parties going on.
Yeah. Talking about parties, do you actually remember your time? I'm going back a bit to your F3 days. Or was it? I think it was F3. You raced the Bahrain Super Prix. Do you remember Bahrain back then to what it is now?
Yeah. That was definitely biting off a bit more than I could chew. So that was 2004, and I had done half a year of the B class, and then I've basically been out of the seat for half a year.
Yeah.
then I managed to get enough support to do the one-off Bahrain Super Prix, and that was just littered with the drives. So Lewis Hamilton was there, Nico Rosberg. It was about 6 guys that went on the F1, and I was stepping from the older spec car to the latest spec car, which I hadn't driven or raced, and half the season out of the season. And I struggled, In the wet, it was okay. I was pretty close to the front, but in the dry at a foreign track and with a new team, that was a waste opportunity. I should have just kept that money for next year, just on testing. And that was a good lesson where, what was hard to get the support from Australia was everyone would sort of say, oh, I'll help you to go racing. But I wouldn't go testing. And the other drivers would have the budget to go testing and a lot of testing. And I'd be just lobbying and doing these races. And that really showed there.
Can you actually explain, because Jeff, my stepdad, was a big part of that, the funding and the whole campaign to get drivers from pretty much no budget to a budget? Can you explain how hard it was just from a driver coming from pretty much nothing to where you got to? Do you know what I mean? Like, you had to work so hard, I had Joey Mawson on the podcast as well, and a lot of race car drivers gamble on their house, literally, and go race. Did you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So I didn't have a luxury of gambling on the house, so I would just spend every day on the phone. I just wake up in the morning, have a list of people to talk to, and you're basically selling yourself all the time, every day, all day. And I remember just in London, just meeting up people all the time and just seeing people, and it's quite funny sometimes where the help comes from. You think you got a couple of strong leads, you're talking to those people, and then just from the side, from left field, someone will come through and offer their help. So what I learned was you keep pressing on, but you got to keep your eyes open, because like life,
you just got to keep going.
Good things come from
you
any
pretty
direction.
You pretty much told me that when it was the last race of the season and a car blew up in front of me, and you're like, keep going, dude. Keep going.
You don't stop. I mean, like I said at Indy, I couldn't see where I was going.
Yeah.
And I didn't stop. And of course, in hindsight, you go, well, that's mad.
Yeah.
But if you don't have that drive and that blind faith and desire to do it at all costs, then you're in the wrong sport.
I've talked a lot about people on the podcast about the risks of motorsport. Have you had any big accidents that you remember or don't remember?
I get asked this one a lot, but the worst one was Monza. So, high speed, as you know.
Yep.
Parabolica. As I got onto the brakes of the Parabolica, I had a tyre blowout and it sunk the right rear, and then the front unloaded, so I couldn't stop the car. So I went straight off at Parabolica really fast. And so quick that the gravel trap didn't slow me up. I just skipped across the gravel and then just hit the straight in the wall. And that was the only time I remember going to the wall thinking, I'll just close my eyes.
Yep.
If they don't open.
Did you just do hands off the wheel at that point? You were like, you can't remember. It was too fast, having too fast. So we're talking about international racing. You actually, before you came back to Australia, actually gave the Toyota Racing Series a go, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. So sort of off the back of the A1 thing, Trevor Schumacher, who's still very involved with the TRS, and that's a great series, asked me to step in and do a couple of races there. Yep. And I really enjoyed that. Ben Gisbergen was racing at the time, I think, and a couple other really good drivers. And the New Zealanders haven't lost the purity of open wheelers, and
Kenny Smith still does it over
Smith
there.
Still does it. They just, for such a small country, they just produce so many
talented drivers. I totally agree.
Drivers, and when you go over there, you realise why. They don't have, all this rubbish of stadium trucks and all these silly categories we got now. They've just got hardcore categories, and they just get on with it.
They stick to a format, don't they? In New Zealand, it's just I think it's 6 classes. I think for the weekend, and away you go. I think you'd have Formula Ford, F3 or open wheelers, and then you'd have the Super Tourers and the GTs and stuff like that.